Whew. Well, that was a crazy week. Where do we all start again? Oh, that's right. The expansion draft. Let's talk about that for a second. If you're here for the first ever live stream on this channel, then you'll probably know what my reaction to a lot of these picks was already, or at least my second reaction, since pretty much all of the picks were spoiled the hours leading up to the actual expansion draft. But again, that kind of happened with Vegas, so it's not like it was totally unexpected, even if it was pretty annoying. But even with knowing who the picks were, the thing we weren't necessarily sure about was what the side deals were going to look like that were involved in those selections, where some of them definitely seemed to have side deals attached based on who was picked. But now that we know the full picture and the fact that there weren't any side deals or at least draft considerations as a part of the expansion draft, with really the only one that had anything tied to it being the Pitlick pick, which we'll get to, let's just say we have a lot more of a full picture on what to think about each one of these selections. So let's get into it. The grades that I'm giving each one of these picks have more to do with how I think Seattle did in the selection and less the player themselves. So we start off in Winnipeg with the selection of Mason Appleton. And this one, honestly, it wouldn't matter whether or not I was grading the player or the selection itself, because either way, I'm giving this one an A. Now, yes, Dylan DeMello was also available, and a lot of people thought that that would be the way the Kraken would go, but as we saw, and honestly as we expected, good defense was quite a bit easier to find in the expansion draft than solid forwards. Plus, at least as far as I'm concerned, Appleton I think has a much bigger upside going forward and is 3 years younger. Plus, is also over $2 million less expensive, at least for this next season, which, as we're going to see, is definitely something that they also valued pretty heavily. The selection of Vitek Vanecek from DC is also going to get an A from me because, well, quite frankly, there just wasn't a better player to be had. I mean, yes, I know Alexander Ovechkin was also left available, but he's a pending UFA and made it very clear that he would sooner retire than play anywhere else in the NHL for the rest of his career. So, I mean, they could have still picked him for the headline, but he would have just gone back to DC in free agency anyway, so it would have been a wasted pick. Not that that necessarily stopped them elsewhere, but still, Vanecek was very much worth the selection here and the best one they could have made. With the selection of Colin from Vancouver, once again, the best player was selected here, albeit from a team that really wasn't offering the Kraken very much to choose from. Really, the only way that this pick could have been any better would be if the Kraken were to have somehow taken advantage of Vancouver in a side deal, but that aside, again, Lind is the best player, even if he really hasn't shown much at the NHL level just yet, and time will tell whether or not he does eventually do that in Seattle. Look, I promise I'm not just being a homer and being too nice to the Kraken with this, but what can I say, the bottom of the alphabet they managed to pick pretty well from, as with the Toronto pick of Jared McCann, I do think that they got the best player here. For pretty much the entirety of my mock drafts, I was going with Alexander Kerfoot, as he is a little bit more seasoned and a little bit more experienced on, like, the penalty kill, for example. But McCann is a year younger and about $600,000 cheaper, which again is definitely something they were looking at and could fill a similar role to what Kerfoot would. So the pick of McCann I've kind of come around on and thinking that that was the best option that they could have gone with. So again, this one's going to be an A, and I almost went A+ because they did take the better player of two pretty tempting options. Not to mention the fact that, for his price anyway, McCann was certainly one of the better forwards available in this expansion draft, so I'm glad the Kraken didn't pass up an opportunity to get him. And even though it did make sense from Toronto's point of view, the fact that they picked him up via trade and then lost him a couple of days later for free is still pretty funny. From the Tampa Bay Lightning, the Kraken got center Yanni Gourde. And this is definitely a team where it was going to be pretty hard for the Kraken not to come away with something pretty valuable here. I mean, either they were going to have some sort of big trade that involved a whole bunch of assets for taking on a contract like Tyler Johnson's, or they were just going to pick one of the good forwards that was left available by Tampa Bay. The only reason I have this one set at an A- rather than an A or better is because they did take on one of the bigger contracts, which helps out Tampa Bay with their salary cap issues, and there's a chance that they could have maybe gotten Tampa Bay to chip in a little bit in order to guarantee that they took one of those bigger contracts, but again, I'm not too upset about it because they did get one of the best players available. That said, the other reason for the A- is the fact that Gourde is currently injured and probably won't be able to get back onto the ice for the Kraken until sometime in November, missing the first month of the season. But once he's on the ice in November, he's definitely going to be able to contribute right away in a big way for Seattle. I'm also going to be giving the Kraken a pretty good grade for their selection of Vince Dunn from St. Louis. I'm even going to go all the way to an A+ on this one. And look, I promise this is the last A of any kind that we're going to have for a little bit. Again, it just so happened that the bottom of the alphabet had quite a few of the Kraken's better picks. For me, on this one anyway, the reason this is an A+ is because of the fact that they avoided the temptation of going for Tarasenko. Now, if they had managed to pick up Tarasenko and trade him in a favorable way to, say, Philadelphia, then maybe that would have been worth not taking Dunn. But Dunn is a solid young defenseman who could very well develop into a top pairing defenseman for Seattle down the road. And for now, assuming he doesn't get traded, probably slots into a third pair that could very well be one of the better third pairs in the game. So I think that this is a very solid selection for the Kraken. Again, they save cap space, and they avoid a tempting name that probably is not worth the contract attached to it, considering the recent injury history that Tarasenko has. Of course, the one wrinkle to this that still has to be sorted out that could change how this looks down the road is the fact that Dunn is set to be an RFA, so the Kraken are going to have to sign him, so I guess we're going to have to see how that signing goes and how worth it this pick really ends up being from a contract standpoint. But for now, I'm sticking with an A+ on this one. From the San Jose Sharks, the Kraken selected center Alexander True. And as promised, there is no A here. Instead, I'm giving this pick a B. Now, it is also true that the Kraken didn't have a whole lot to pick from when it came to the Sharks, and also that True himself could be a decent player down the road and is an okay depth forward for the time being, probably starting off in the AHL, and does also have ties to the Seattle area, having played for the WHL's Thunderbirds. Ultimately, to me, this just comes down to the fact that there were a couple of options that made a little bit more sense than True here. For one, there was another cheap 24-year-old forward in Dylan Gambrell, who also is not set to be an RFA like True is right now, and still has one more year on his contract before becoming an RFA. So the Kraken are going to have to sign True, even if it is probably to a similar type of deal of what he was on. Not to mention the fact that even though he hasn't necessarily shined there, Gambrell does have significantly more NHL experience at this point than True does. And even if the Kraken were going to go for a player without a contract that they could then negotiate with and figure out what they wanted to sign them to, then I think the better option was Ryan Donato. Donato is also a center, just a year older, and also an RFA, though he has actually played very well and has a decent amount of experience at the NHL level, so he probably will sign for quite a bit more than True will. But again, getting NHL players that can contribute is not necessarily a bad thing, so the fact that they skipped on Donato here and went for True is maybe doesn't make the biggest difference down the road, but definitely a confusing one, and to me, True's probably not the best pick they could have gone with. But still, it's exciting for Thunderbird fans. From the Pittsburgh Penguins, the Kraken selected Brandon Tanev, and again, I'm going to give this one a B, but Tanev is not a bad player. He's definitely what it seems like the Kraken were looking for in a solid two-way forward that maybe doesn't have as much scoring potential as other forwards might, but is definitely not afraid to play the physical, defensive part of the game and will serve pretty well on what I imagine will be a third line for the Kraken. The reason that I'm giving this one a B, though, is because I again think that there was a better option that could have filled a similar role in Zach Aston Reese. Now, I wasn't necessarily terribly disappointed that they passed on Jason Zucker, but again, Zach Aston Reese does seem like he would have been a cheaper, 3-year younger, and also can play center, similar version to what they're looking to get out of Tanev. Granted, Tanev does have quite a bit more experience and has some Selke votes over the last couple of years, so it's not that it's a terrible pick. I just think Aston Reese would have been a better one. I was even tempted to go B- with this, but ultimately the reason I kept it at a B is because, well, let's just say Tanev's personality off the ice is more than enough to make me enjoy this pick quite a bit. And that brings us to the Philadelphia Flyers, where the Kraken picked Carsen Twarynski, which, yeah. I get that you need AHL players, and apparently Twarynski's advanced underlying stats are pretty good, and he is just 23, so maybe he does develop into something down the road, and I end up looking foolish for not liking this pick, but I certainly won't be the only one with some of the other names that were available, like JVR for example. Now, I get with JVR, he's on a pretty expensive contract for another 3 more years, while also being 31 years old, but he's still very much still producing for the Flyers. He may even have been their best forward this last year, so if you're gonna tell me that he isn't at least right now worth the majority of his contract, and that the Kraken couldn't have used some help on the forward end from him, then I think you're lying to yourself. But okay, Seattle wants to save as much cap space as possible for the upcoming free agency, which they can definitely weaponize. That probably does eliminate JVR and even Voracek, but I still think that Gostisbehere could have been a decent option here, and you could have even gotten Philadelphia to kick something in order to take him, because, well, they kicked in a fair amount for Arizona to take him just a couple of days later. And look, I get that Gostisbehere hasn't looked necessarily worth his contract over the last couple of years in Philadelphia, but let's just say the Flyers have seemed pretty done with him as much as he seems to have been done with them over the last couple of years as well, so when you're talking about a player that very badly needed a change of scenery and could end up giving you quite a bit more in return than what you gave for them, he is certainly a prime candidate for that. So I wouldn't have hated the idea of the Kraken going for him if they wanted to save a couple of $1 million and maybe even get a couple of draft picks in return. But okay, maybe his $4.5 million and potential couple of draft picks that come with him is still a little too expensive for 2 more years. Still, on the defensive end for quite a bit cheaper at $1.6 million, there was Robert Hagg, who is still on contract for 1 season, so definitely a type of player that could have contributed there, and maybe even the Kraken just end up dealing with him considering the other options they are able to pick up on the defensive end. Either way, still probably better value than what you're gonna get out of Twarynski, so ultimately I just don't get this pick really much at all. The only reason I'm giving this a C- rather than a D or worse is because of the fact that this does seem like a pick that the analytical team made, and maybe because of his youth and the fact that he really hasn't been able to show much at the NHL level just yet, he develops into something and we all look stupid for doubting this pick down the road. But for now, I don't get it. From the Ottawa Senators, the Kraken selected goaltender Joey Daccord, who is a young AHL goaltender that honestly hasn't looked great in his limited experience at the NHL level and not even necessarily fantastic at the AHL level, but still, he's young and there really wasn't a lot to choose from the Senators, so even if he doesn't really turn in anything down the road, then no harm, no foul. The only thing they miss out on here is a chance at Chris Tierney that is probably the pick that I would have taken, but again, doesn't make a big enough difference to go anywhere other than a B with this one. And no, it's pretty clear they weren't going to be taking on that Dadonov contract without some incentive. From the Rangers, the Kraken pick up Colin Blackwell, who is a very hardworking center that honestly a lot of people were, I think, expecting to be on the protection list, but he was still kind of a fringe candidate for it anyway, so it's not like it's a giant surprise that he was exposed. So the fact that the Kraken are getting a decent, hardworking two-way center is a decent pick, but again, I think personally I still would have leaned toward Julien Gauthier, but I'm not overly upset about this, and I don't know that it makes a huge difference for the Kraken going forward, so we'll call it a B+. Speaking of players though that were surprises to see left exposed, when it came to the Islanders, they chose to protect Cal Clutterbuck and Matt Martin over Josh Bailey and Jordan Eberle, very much daring the Kraken to take one of these larger-ish contracts off of their hands, which, when it came to Eberle, the Kraken were all too happy to do as they ended up taking him. And when it comes to the Kraken, who on the forward end seem to be especially interested in these flexible, defensively responsible forwards that can contribute on both ends of the ice, I think they were all too pleased to see Eberle available, and all too happy to scoop up one of the Islanders' better forwards from this last season. So, at least for me, even if I would have been just as happy with Josh Bailey, and considering their penchant in this to go for the cheaper players, I'm a little surprised they didn't go for Otto Koivula or Kiefer Bellows. I'm giving this one an A. From the New Jersey Devils, the Kraken pick up 23-year-old forward Nathan Bastian, and well, yes, Will Butcher was also available and would have been a pick I would have been maybe just as happy with. I think Bastian was probably the right pick here, where honestly there weren't that many options, assuming the Kraken weren't going to get paid a whole lot to take on the last year of PK Subban's contract. So I'm also going to give this one an A, which is also helped out by the fact that they managed to avoid taking a player with the last name Quenneville here, where David Quenneville was available on the defensive end. And you might think that that shouldn't play too big of a role, considering David Quenneville was pretty far down the list even on the Devils as far as best picks the Kraken could have made. But yeah, we'll get there. With the first pick in the draft, the Seattle Kraken selected from the Nashville Predators my boy Calle Järnkrok, who, well, yeah, I still probably would have liked the idea of them taking Jakub Trenin, was probably the right pick here, especially considering they managed to avoid those two large contracts at the top end with Duchesne and Johansson, so ultimately this was probably the best pick, so I'll give it an A+. I mean, with the way Marchand did this pick, could you really give it anything else? I mean, to me anyway, especially with the picks having been spoiled beforehand, Marchand was definitely the highlight of this draft. When it came to the expansion draft, the Montreal Canadiens were certainly the team that most people were interested to see what the Kraken were going to do with because of the exposure of Carey Price. And I am going to give their selection of Cale Fleury a B here, but it's not because they skipped on Price. Honestly, the fact that they skipped on Price made the pick of Cale Fleury a little bit better to me. Now, Price did just carry the Canadiens to the Stanley Cup final during the playoffs, but he hasn't looked that great during the last couple of regular seasons, and that contract of $10.5 million for 5 more years would have put a pretty big dent in that cap space that the Kraken are trying to save for free agency. And you can make all the arguments you want about selecting Carey Price helping them with marketing and selling tickets, but when it comes to the Seattle Kraken, that really doesn't seem like it's going to be very much of an issue, at least for the first couple of years. And even if, which I think is a pretty big if that I wouldn't expect happening, that does become an issue in, say, 3 or 4 years, by then having Carey Price on what looks like a terrible deal at that point would not help things too much. Ultimately then, the reason I'm giving this pick a B rather than an A doesn't have so much to do with them skipping over Carey Price because, well, I do think they made the right decision by doing that. It still would have been pretty fun to have him in Seattle and to see all of the chaos that ensued from them taking him from Montreal. It really has more to do with the fact that I think there were still better options than Cale Fleury, especially considering we're not even sure whether or not he'll end up being an NHL contributing player down the road. There still was Philip Deneau on the forward end, who is set to be UFA, so they could still get him in free agency, but there was still Brett Kulak with a contract on the defensive end as well that I think probably would have been a better pick. From the Minnesota Wild, the Kraken picked up defenseman Carson Soucy, and honestly I would have been equally as happy with either Soucy or Kokkonen in goal, but they ended up getting their goaltenders elsewhere and decided that they were happy with just 3. Plus, the option of Soucy on the defensive end was a much better option than they had from DC, where they got Vanecek, that probably fills the role that Kokkonen would have. So I have no problem giving this pick an A, as Soucy is a solid defenseman, and unless he's traded, will be able to contribute right away on the defensive end for the Kraken to start off the season. So up until this point anyway, I've been pretty happy with, or at least not disappointed by, pretty much all of these picks, the issue of Philadelphia aside anyway. But when it comes to the LA Kings, that definitely changes, where the Kraken selected defenseman Kurtis MacDermid. Now, right off the bat, yes, it's true there wasn't a whole ton to choose from when it came to the Kings, but there still were a number of better options. A couple that stand out were Andreas Athanasiou, who personally I thought would have been the best pick here, but even if they wanted to go for a defenseman, Cale Clegg definitely would have been a better choice than MacDermid. But maybe there still is a way to make sense of all of this. After all, coming out of the expansion draft, the Kraken did have to have 20 players with contracts, and MacDermid is one of those. Meanwhile, Athanasiou and Clegg didn't have contracts, so they wouldn't have helped fill that requirement. But even then, there's still a number of better options, even on the Kings, with contracts like Brendan Lemieux, Austin Wagner, Blake Lizotte, and even Carl Grundstrom. And I'll even leave out Olli Maatta, as that $3.3 million is probably something they weren't looking at to save cap space. Alright then, so if this didn't have anything to do with meeting requirements, then maybe this is like the situation in Philadelphia where it's just a relatively unknown guy that seemingly has pretty good underlying stats, and this just is the analytics department looking for a diamond in the rough. Well, not really, considering with this guy there really isn't anything statistically that I can find or anyone else that I've seen that would suggest that he has any kind of upside, certainly better than any of those guys on the forward end as other options. So really, when it comes to this pick, I cannot think of any good reason that the Kraken would have gone with MacDermid here, and even with that, they still aren't going to be able to save cap space by letting him go in free agency because, again, he still has a year left on his contract, so I guess he's just going to go to the AHL where he does nothing of value for the team. So as far as I'm concerned with this pick, this is a big fat F. I mean, I hope I'm wrong. Maybe he turns things around and goes crazy, but yeah, I wouldn't expect it. Fortunately, right after that mess alphabetically, or at least reverse alphabetically, is the Florida Panthers, with one of my absolute favorite picks in this entire draft, even if it was the worst kept secret of any of them, as we knew days before the rest of the picks were even spoiled that this was going to be the Kraken's selection in Chris Driedger. Now, it's true that from Florida there were other decent options available, the biggest name of which being Frank Vatrano on the forward end, but Driedger is a young goaltender coming off of a fantastic season for the Panthers, where he put up a .927 save percentage and a 2.07 goals against average, which are both well above league average. And granted, if he does turn out to be Seattle's starting option, or at least 1A option, it is a bit of a gamble for the Kraken to take, considering he wouldn't be the first young goaltender to have a fantastic season, get a new contract, go somewhere else, and then have a bit of regression, but I don't think that you can expect that even if it has happened a number of times elsewhere, even in recent years. Plus, he is coming to a situation in Seattle where he'll have a pretty solid defensive core and even defensive forwards in front of him, so I wouldn't expect that he's going to be the guy where everything's put on his shoulders right away and should be able to flourish with the Kraken. So as far as I'm concerned, this is an absolute A+ pick, especially considering they signed him for really not too bad of a deal at 3 years, $3.5 million per. From the Edmonton Oilers, the Seattle Kraken signed and selected another UFA in Adam Larsson. And by the sounds of it afterwards, the Oilers were kind of expecting him to come back and sign with them for a similar deal to what he got in Seattle. But the Kraken got him for 4 years, $4 million per. He's another pretty experienced 28-year-old defenseman who doesn't offer a ton when it comes to scoring, but definitely does a lot for the Kraken on the defensive end, where he plays a pretty physical game and blocks a lot of shots. So again, just another piece to this strong defensive puzzle that Seattle has put together. So really the only reason I'm giving this one a B+ rather than something in the A range is because there were also some options on the forward end like Dominic Cahoon or Kyle Turris, or even Tyler Benson, who probably would have been my favorite in the end, but that is a little bit more of a wait and see kind of thing where he could turn into a good player down the road. Well, it is true that Adam Larsson can contribute for the Kraken right away. As we mentioned before, leading up to the event itself, pretty much all of the picks were spoiled. The one team that was able to actually keep their pick a secret was the Detroit Red Wings. That being said, it wasn't a particularly exciting secret that they kept, as the Kraken picked Dennis Cholowski. I'm going to end up giving this pick a C for the first letter in his last name, and also because even though he is 23 and still could develop into a decent player down the road, especially if his advanced stats, which it seems like are what got him selected, turn out to be a true depictor of his future ability, there still were some better options that he was chosen over, like Evgeny Svechnikov or Vladislav Nemestikov on the forward end, or more notably Troy Stecher on the defensive end. And speaking of teams that did not give the Kraken very much to choose from, with the Dallas Stars, this is one of the teams that did the best in preparing for this expansion draft, really not giving the Kraken almost any options at all outside of UFA Jamie Oleksiak, so the Kraken ended up signing and taking Oleksiak, with the main theme of this expansion draft clearly being the Kraken coming into it defensive first, whether that was through the defensemen themselves or defensively responsible forwards. The other theme was size, which at 6'7", Oleksiak is the shining jewel of. Really, the only reason that I have this pick at an A- rather than something better, even with there being pretty much no other options from the Stars, is the fact that the contract they sign Oleksiak to at $4.6 million per year for 5 seasons is maybe a little bit more expensive than they could have gotten him for in free agency, but we don't have to wait and see, and they don't have to get into a bidding war now, so it really isn't that much worse. Plus, again, with there being limited other options from Dallas, they might as well have just picked him up and locked him up while they could. The Blue Jackets seemed to be another one of these teams that weren't going to be offering the Kraken a whole heck of a lot in the expansion draft, with likely their best option coming down to either Eric Robinson or Kevin Stenlund, or maybe Dean Kukin on the defensive end. But then when protection lists came out, Eric Robinson had been protected and Max Domi was left exposed. Now, Domi was coming off of an injury and probably wouldn't play till November or December, so it wasn't necessarily an ideal situation, but again, Yanni Gourde probably will be out for a month anyway, so picking up a pretty good center, even if he can't start for you right away, still seemed like the option that most people were expecting the Kraken to go with. Instead, we ended up with Gavin Bayreuther, which at the time seemed fine, I guess, since you do save cap space, which they were clearly valuing, don't have to deal with Domi's recovery, and also probably are going to get something in return for that pick that we just didn't know about. But now we know they didn't get anything in return. They literally just straight up took Gavin Bayreuther instead of any of those other options. This is another one I just don't get. With the Avalanche, a lot of people are assuming for a long time that Ryan Graves would be the player that they would lose to Seattle. But then when they dealt him for pieces they didn't have to worry about protecting, it seemed like they had done a very good job, all things considered, with the amount of choices they had, of protecting their bases for not losing a particularly big piece for nothing. That is, up until they protected Logan O'Connor instead of Jonas Donskoi. And of course, and rightly so, the Kraken were all too happy to scoop up Donskoi as their pick, which to me is another fantastic pick, very well worth an A. Now, they did also expose Landeskog, but he's set to be a UFA and doesn't seem like he's likely to sign with Colorado, so, well, let's just say we've mentioned a few times how much Seattle was valuing cap space in this expansion draft, so that they could make some moves in free agency. Of course, when it came to the expansion draft event itself, that wasn't quite all there was to the Donskoi pick. I mean, even outside of Sean Kemp absolutely butchering his name in hilarious fashion, which I can't really blame him for, they also announced the Donskoi pick right after the Chicago Blackhawks pick, which, based on who they took there, definitely seemed like a diversion tactic because from the Blackhawks, the Kraken selected John Quenneville. I just don't get it. Why Quenneville? This is exactly why we talked about earlier with the Devils that it was a good thing that they managed to avoid taking a player like David Quenneville, because taking John Quenneville from the Blackhawks makes just about as much sense if they had done that with the Devils, maybe even less. Again, like the Kurtis MacDermid pick, analytically there's nothing that I can find that would justify this selection. Now, granted, NHL analytic departments have a little bit more access to stats than you and I do, but still, I can't imagine that there's that much hidden value that they have access to that we couldn't even see a little bit of to make me think that this was worth it. And unlike that MacDermid pick, Quenneville doesn't have a contract for next year, which fully eliminates any possibility of this being a pick in order to just meet expansion draft requirements. So how the heck did this end up being the pick over, say, Nikita Zadorov, who I assumed being a large physical defenseman would have fit exactly what they had been trying to do with the rest of this expansion draft? Now, you can say with Zadorov that he may or may not be worth what he's been paid up to this point, but he's set to be an RFA, which would give the Kraken just about all the control they could want to sign him to whatever they want or match what somebody else could offer. Even outside of Zadorov, though, also on the defensive end for the Blackhawks, there's also Calvin DeHaan. Now, we can assume because of their value of cap space that that $4.5 million contract, even though it is going to expire at the end of this year, was just not something they wanted to pay. So, fine. Not DeHaan. Zadorov, maybe they just assumed they were going to have to pay more than they wanted to keep him, so moving on from them. On the forward end, though, there's another guy without a contract who would have been maybe the best pick of anyone they could have gotten from the Blackhawks, that being Adam Gaudette. So let's just take a second to see if we can find one logical reason why they would want to take Quenneville over Gaudette. Now, Gaudette does not project to be a superstar or anything like that, so as far as what they could eventually offer down the road, it probably doesn't make a massive difference in the grand scheme of things. But still, this is the kind of decision that really makes you scratch your head and wonder what the heck they were thinking. Now, Gaudette has significantly more NHL experience while still being a little bit younger, not significantly younger, but still for the age difference to NHL experience difference, it's a pretty big gap. Plus, Gaudette's actually been able to contribute in his time playing at the NHL level, where Quenneville, well, let's just say not so much. Plus, there's also the fun fact that Gaudette did come to Chicago from Vancouver, so if, let's just say, he had come to the Kraken and then turned into a decent player that could be a thorn in the side of the Canucks, that'd be pretty entertaining to watch. Now, granted, picking a player just so he can be a thorn in the side of a rival who also happens to be his old team is not a reason to pick a player, but we're struggling to find reasons that they took Quenneville, not Gaudette, so it really only adds to it. But even with all of that aside, there is one potential reason that I could see that they went for Quenneville, which is also the same reason that I think they might have gone for Bayreuther from Columbus, or at least it's the only thing I can think of that they were thinking with these picks. And that is that both are set to be UFAs, so considering how much they're valuing cap space, they very well could have just picked both of these guys in order to let them walk in free agency, and then basically have gotten zero cap hit from both of those picks. And if that really is the reason for both of these picks, then at least with Columbus, the alternative options did have contracts, so it's definitely not the decision I would have made there, but at least there's maybe some sense to it if they really just were that hard on saving cap space. Meanwhile, back to Chicago, Adam Gaudette again is set to be an RFA, so if they're picking Quenneville just to let him walk in free agency, then I can't see any reason that they wouldn't pick Gaudette, who they could also just let walk in free agency. An RFA gives them a little bit more control in order to keep the player than a UFA, which also could be useful, but it doesn't hinder them at all from just letting him go to another team and sign elsewhere. Plus, with Gaudette, there's also the added bonus that he could be worth at least something via trade. I mean, granted, it would probably be a pretty late round pick at best, but that's still better than the nothing you're going to get from Quenneville. So again, when the pick was made, the assumption here was that there was a side deal, even though there were reports from Chicago that there wasn't one, but a side deal was the only way it made sense. And now that there's no side deal, it makes no sense. Which is about how much they're likely to pay Quenneville, but still. But we'll calm things down a little bit and move on to the Carolina Hurricanes, where the Kraken selected Morgan Qeekie, and I know there's probably a fair number of people that are just about as upset as I was with the Chicago pick that they didn't take Jake Bean here. And granted, I fully agree that Jake Bean probably was the right pick here, but I'm not really that upset with the fact that they ended up going with Qeekie over Bean. Again, Bean, who is no longer even in Carolina, probably was the right pick, but at least here the guy that they got instead in Qeekie does at least have some value, and honestly, it could even be pretty big value down the road, as this is a guy who maybe hasn't done a whole lot yet at the NHL level, but even in some of his time at the NHL level and certainly at the AHL level, has shown that he can be a pretty strong points producer from the center position, which, even if he doesn't play for the Kraken right away, is certainly something they could use in the years to come. It is a bit of a wait-and-see situation and a bit of a gamble that the Kraken are taking here, but I think it's one well worth taking, and if it pans out, could even turn out to be that they made the right decision here, especially considering Bean is also a young defender and is also a little bit in that we'll just see where he goes kind of phase of his career. From the Calgary Flames, to the surprise of no one, the Kraken selected Mark Giordano. Now, this might have been a little bit more of a surprise if the picks hadn't been spoiled, considering the amount of cap shaving they had done up until this point, but still, it wasn't a terribly surprising pick considering the alternative options, and the fact that Giordano does bring a lot of NHL experience to a team that's definitely going to need it because they are very much on the younger end for the most part, and still can contribute pretty well on the defensive end, at least based on his last couple of seasons, even at the age of 37. Now yes, $6.75 million is a lot to be paying a defenseman that will be 38 by the end of the season, but the contract also expires at the end of the season, so if it doesn't work out this year in Seattle, then honestly no harm no foul, and if the Kraken do have a captain in their first season, it'll probably be Giordano. From the Buffalo Sabres, there really wasn't very much for the Kraken to pick from, so they ended up getting Will Borgen, who's a young defenseman that maybe turns into something down the road, and honestly, I still probably would have gone for the only other real option here in Colin Miller, if for no other reason than the fact that he does have that experience of having been a part of that inaugural Vegas team. From the Boston Bruins, the Kraken correctly selected defenseman Jérémy Lauzon, but there still were a couple of options that could have maybe tempted them away, like Nick Ritchie on the forward end, and Lauzon definitely will be able to step in and contribute right away on that solid D core that the Kraken will have. It's a pick that I like enough to give it an A+. From the Arizona Coyotes, the trading of Adin Hill to the Sharks left almost nothing for the Kraken to pick from. Really, their options were down to Christian Fischer, who was probably the best option, or Tyler Pitlick is the one they ended up going with. Again, this probably wasn't the best option that they had as a selection, but it is the one that seems to have come attached with a plan beyond just the pick, because Pitlick was traded the next day to the Calgary Flames for a 4th round pick in the 2022 draft. Part of me feels like they could have maybe gotten a little bit more than a 4th from Pitlick, but maybe that's just hopeful thinking, and even if they couldn't necessarily get that from Pitlick, they might have been able to get more than a 4th worth out of Christian Fischer, but you never know. I'm sure they've shopped their options, and Pitlick to Fischer really isn't a massive difference, so it is what it is. And finally, from the Anaheim Ducks, the Kraken selected defenseman Haydn Fleury, who is Cale Fleury, their pick from the Canadiens' older brother, so it's kind of cool that they got a pair of brothers, even if there's not necessarily a huge chance that they end up playing side by side for the Kraken, but it's still kind of a fun story at the very least. It also definitely locks in the fact that if your last name is Fleury and you're exposed in an NHL expansion draft, you better believe you're getting picked. I give this pick a B because to me there's at least marginally better options in like Danton Heinen or Alexander Volkov, but I don't know that they're significantly better. And with this one, it is a guy that Ron Francis has a fair amount of experience with from his time in Carolina, where Fleury was originally drafted. So I don't know that it really makes a huge difference, and maybe Fleury can turn into a pretty good player with Ron Francis leading the way. All in all, just like I said the day of, even before we knew there weren't any side deals, I'm in general pretty happy with the way this expansion draft went. Yes, it's true the forward end leaves a little bit to be desired, but that was true of Vegas with their forward end as well, and the Kraken are coming into free agency with quite a bit more cap space to play with and some pretty decent options that they could sign, Landeskog definitely among them. Even still, I don't know that this forward group is going to be terribly impressive when the season does get started, even if they do pick up Landeskog and a couple of other pieces. And they're still going to rely, much like Vegas did, on a couple of players having career-type years in the first season, which a guy like Mason Appleton is definitely one of the guys I would look at that potentially happening. Outside of the forwards though, their goaltending is a bit of a gamble considering it's a couple of younger guys who do have limited NHL experience, even if the experience they have, especially in Driedger's case, has gone particularly well. But that being said, the goaltenders are also going to be helped out by the fact that they have a very strong D-core in front of them. So if anything, this Kraken team probably isn't going to be getting scored on a whole heck of a lot, even if they don't necessarily do a whole heck of a lot of scoring on the other end. So as far as what that means for expectations for this team in their first season, again, a lot is going to depend on how they weaponize this cap space that they've built up and saved during the expansion draft, during free agency, and trades that they could make with teams that are up against the cap. As far as right now is concerned, I still think that this is very much a team that can compete for that third spot in the Pacific, largely because of how weak the Pacific Division is. So are they going to be the best team or on anybody's radar to make a deep playoff run? Definitely not, but they're definitely not one of the worst teams in the NHL either, even with this roster as it stands right now. And again, it's going to change quite a bit by the time the season gets going, and probably only gets better from here. But as always, please do feel free, as I'm sure you would anyway, to let me know what you think down in the comments section. Otherwise, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. And until next time, be good to each other and go Kraken. Peace.